The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with their usual soft hiss, revealing the grand assembly hall that had witnessed 1,000 years of interstellar politics. Representatives from dozens of species filed in for the morning session, their various forms creating a colorful tapestry of alien life. The Vorthak, with their scaled skin and proud bearing, took their seats near the front. The crystalline Nexus beings caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the polished walls. The gaseous ethereals floated in their containment suits, while the insectoid Krell clicked and buzzed among themselves. Ambassador Kethran of the Vorthak Empire settled into his designated seat and began reviewing the day's agenda on his datapad. Trade disputes, territorial boundaries, scientific research allocations, the same routine matters that kept the galaxy running smoothly. He glanced around the chamber, noting which delegates had arrived and which were still making their way to their seats. His practiced eye swept across the familiar faces and forms, cataloging attendance as he had done for the past 15 years. It was then that he noticed something wrong. The human section was empty, not just the kind of empty that meant they were running late for the session. The seats were completely bare, stripped of the personal items and technological devices that usually marked a delegate's workspace. The small Earth flag that Captain Jake Morrison always kept on his desk was gone. The portable holographic display that Dr. Lisa Campbell used for her presentations had vanished. Even the coffee maker that the humans had installed in their corner, much to the amusement of other species, was nowhere to be seen. Kethran frowned and checked his chronometer. The humans were never late. In fact, they were usually the first to arrive and the last to leave. Captain Morrison had a reputation for being so punctual that other delegates set their own schedules by his arrival time. Dr. Campbell was known for staying after sessions to discuss research projects with anyone who showed interest. The human delegation's work ethic was something that even their critics acknowledged. The Vorthak ambassador activated his communication device and sent a query to the Council's administrative office. Perhaps there had been a scheduling change he missed. Perhaps the humans had requested permission to skip today's session for some emergency back on Earth. But the response that came back made his frown deepen. No requests had been filed. No communications had been received from the human delegation. As more delegates noticed the empty human section, a low murmur began to spread through the chamber. The hegemony representative, a tall being with 4 arms and silver skin, leaned over to speak with the delegate from the Spiral Confederation. Their conversation was conducted in hushed tones, but Kethran could see their concerned expressions. The insectoid Krell were becoming agitated, their clicking becoming more rapid and urgent. Council Chairman Veltar, whose crystalline form towered over even the tallest organic beings, called the session to order. His voice resonated through the chamber with the musical quality that made his species such effective diplomats. But even Veltar seemed distracted as his multifaceted gaze swept over the empty human seats. "Before we begin today's proceedings," Veltar announced, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber, "we must address the apparent absence of the human delegation. Has anyone received communication from Earth regarding this matter?" The chamber fell silent. No one responded. The various species looked at each other with expressions that ranged from confusion to growing concern. The humans had never simply failed to appear before. Even during the 3 major crises of the past decade, they had maintained their presence and their contributions to council deliberations. Administrative Assistant Klavtek, a small but efficient being from the Outer Rim, scurried forward with a data tablet in his many-fingered hands. He spoke in the rapid, nervous manner that characterized his species when delivering unwelcome news. "Chairman Veltar, our records show that the human delegation checked out of their quarters 3 days ago. All personal belongings were removed. All access codes were deactivated. All research materials from Dr. Campbell's laboratory have been cleared out. The humans appear to have departed the station entirely." A wave of surprised exclamations rippled through the assembly. The Vorthak delegates began speaking among themselves in their guttural language. The ethereal's containment suits flickered with agitated energy patterns. Even the usually calm Nexus representatives seemed disturbed by this revelation. "Departed." Veltar repeated the word slowly, as if testing its meaning. Did they file departure documentation? Did they provide notification of their intentions? Klovetek consulted his tablet again, his small fingers dancing across the surface with practiced speed. No formal departure documents were filed, Chairman. However, we did discover one archived message in the long-term storage system. It appears to have been placed there some time ago, but set to be discovered only after their departure. The chamber grew even quieter, if such a thing were possible. Every being present focused their attention on the small administrative assistant, as he prepared to deliver what was clearly an important message. The message is from Admiral Susan Wright, identified as the senior human representative. It reads, "Humanity thanks the Galactic Council for the educational experience. We will proceed independently from this point forward. Do not attempt to contact us." Klovetek looked up from his tablet with obvious nervousness. That is the complete message, Chairman. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Educational experience. The phrase hung in the air, like a challenge. Many of the assembled delegates had considered humanity's membership in the Council to be a privilege granted to a younger, less advanced species. The humans were seen as eager students, grateful for the opportunity to learn from the wisdom of more established galactic civilizations. They performed useful functions, certainly. They provided raw materials from their system, supplied workers for various projects, and offered perspectives that sometimes proved valuable, but they were generally viewed as junior partners in the great work of galactic governance. The idea that humans had viewed their entire participation as merely an educational experience suggested a completely different understanding of their relationship with the Council. It implied that they had been studying the other species rather than simply learning from them. It suggested that they had been observers rather than true participants. Ambassador Zeflos of the Hegemony was the first to break the stunned silence. His forearms gestured in the complex patterns that his species used to emphasize important points. Perhaps we should investigate this matter more thoroughly before drawing conclusions. Young species sometimes act impulsively. They may simply be expressing frustration over some minor diplomatic incident. But even as he spoke, other delegates were receiving reports from their own intelligence networks. The Vorthak military attaché approached Kethran with a datapad containing disturbing information. Human mining operations throughout the galaxy had shut down simultaneously. Human-managed trade routes had ceased operation. Human technical advisors had vanished from dozens of worlds without warning or explanation. Dr. Mothrun, the Council's chief science advisor, rose from his seat with obvious agitation. His species was known for their methodical approach to problem-solving, but even he seemed shaken by the implications of what was being discovered. Chairman Veltar, I must report that Dr. Campbell's research laboratory has been completely emptied. Not just her personal belongings, but all of her research data, all of her ongoing experiments, all of her technical specifications. 3 years of breakthrough discoveries in quantum mechanics and bioengineering have simply vanished. The full scope of humanity's departure was becoming clear, and it was far more comprehensive than anyone had imagined. This had not been an impulsive decision or an emotional response to some perceived slight. The humans had planned their exit with careful precision, removing every trace of their contributions while taking nothing that belonged to other species. They had essentially erased themselves from galactic civilization in the span of a few days. What disturbed many delegates most was the realization that such a coordinated withdrawal required significant planning and organization. The humans had maintained their normal routines and friendly relationships right up until their departure. No one had suspected that they were preparing to leave. This suggested a level of discipline and strategic thinking that made their characterization as a young species seem suddenly questionable. As reports continued to flow in from across the galaxy, one fact became increasingly clear. Humanity had not just left the Council. They had vanished entirely from known space, taking with them knowledge, skills, and contributions that many species had taken for granted. The session was suspended as delegates scrambled to assess the full implications of humanity's silent exodus. 3 months had passed since the humans vanished from galactic civilization, and the first real problems were starting to show themselves. What had initially seemed like a minor inconvenience was growing into something much more serious. The Galactic Council had dismissed humanity's departure as the tantrum of an immature species, but now the cracks in their perfect system were becoming impossible to ignore. The Kepler trade route, which connected 17 different star systems and carried nearly 30% of all galactic commerce, had descended into complete chaos. Ships that should have arrived at their destinations weeks ago were still wandering through space, their captains confused and lost. The complex scheduling system that had kept thousands of vessels moving in perfect coordination had simply collapsed. Commander Ryan Beck had been the human liaison for interstellar logistics. Most council members had barely noticed him during their years of service together. He was just another human technician who handled the boring details that more important beings did not want to deal with. He worked quietly in his small office, managing shipping schedules and cargo manifests with the same steady efficiency that characterized all human work. But now that he was gone, the true scope of his responsibilities was becoming clear. The Yar shipping routes that had seemed to run themselves had actually required constant attention and adjustment. Beck had been coordinating with hundreds of different species, each with their own customs, languages, and business practices. He had somehow made it all work smoothly, keeping goods flowing and preventing the kind of delays that could cripple entire planetary economies. Captain Zektor of the merchant vessel Stardancer sat in his command chair and stared at the navigation display with growing frustration. His ship was carrying medical supplies that were desperately needed on 3 different worlds, but the delivery schedule made no sense anymore. The timing windows that used to be calculated automatically now showed nothing but error messages. The backup systems that should have taken over when the primary network failed were not working either. How did that human make this look so easy? Zektor muttered to his first officer, a young hegemony female named Siltra. She had been trying for hours to manually calculate a route that would get them to their destinations before the medical supplies expired. Perhaps he had access to systems we do not know about, Siltra suggested, but her voice carried doubt. Beck had never seemed to use anything more sophisticated than a standard data terminal and an old-fashioned paper notebook that he carried everywhere. The other humans had teased him about his preference for writing things down by hand, but he had just smiled and continued his work. The military situation was even worse. The Council's combined fleet, which had maintained peace across the galaxy for centuries, was suffering one humiliating defeat after another. Small groups of pirates that should have been easy to handle were running circles around some of the most advanced warships in known space. Admiral Gexelo stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Eternal Victory and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. His fleet had just suffered another embarrassing loss to a ragtag collection of smugglers and raiders who should not have posed any threat to proper military vessels. The pirates had used tactics that seemed to come from nowhere, striking at exactly the right moment and disappearing before the Council ships could respond. General Kate Sullivan had been humanity's senior military advisor to the Council. Like most humans in positions of authority, she had been quiet and unassuming. She attended meetings, offered suggestions when asked, and generally stayed in the background while more senior officers from other species made the important decisions. Her ideas were often unusual, sometimes even strange, but they had a curious way of working when other approaches failed. The Vorthak High Command had considered her methods primitive and overly simple. She talked about concepts like psychological warfare and flexible tactics that seemed to come from some ancient era of warfare. More advanced species had moved beyond such crude approaches centuries ago. They relied on superior technology and overwhelming firepower to solve military problems. But now that Sullivan was gone, those primitive tactics were being used against them by every 2-bit criminal organization in the galaxy. The pirates were employing hit-and-run strategies, psychological manipulation, and unpredictable battle patterns that the Council's military computers could not analyze or counter. It was as if humanity had taught the galaxy's criminals everything they needed to know about fighting more advanced opponents. The economic problems were spreading faster than anyone had expected. Mining operations on dozens of worlds had ground to a complete halt. The sophisticated extraction techniques that had been increasing productivity for years had stopped working almost overnight. Equipment that had been running smoothly for months suddenly required maintenance that no one knew how to perform. Engineer Danny Torres had been responsible for upgrading mining operations throughout the Outer Rim territories. His innovations had seemed simple enough at the time. He would spend a few weeks on each world, working with local crews to modify existing equipment and improve efficiency. The changes he made never seemed revolutionary or particularly advanced. He used standard tools and common materials, making adjustments that any competent engineer should have been able to understand. But when the mining crews tried to maintain Torres's modifications without his guidance, they discovered that his work was far more complex than it appeared. Each change he had made was connected to dozens of other modifications in ways that were not immediately obvious. When one component failed, it created a cascade of problems that shut down entire operations. Mine supervisor Colvin stood in the control room of the largest titanium extraction facility in the sector and watched helplessly as his productivity numbers continued to fall. The automated systems that Torres had installed were displaying error messages that made no sense. The backup procedures that should have kept the operation running were failing one after another. "Did he leave any documentation?" Colvin asked, his chief engineer, a Nexus being whose crystalline structure usually made him excellent at understanding complex technical systems. "Nothing useful," the engineer replied, his harmonic voice carrying frustrated overtones. "His reports describe what he did but not why he did it. The modifications appear random when examined individually, but they must have served some greater purpose that we cannot identify." Similar problems were appearing in medical facilities across the galaxy. Dr. Amanda Foster had been working quietly, in research hospitals and medical centers, developing new treatments and improving existing procedures. Her work had saved millions of lives and reduced suffering for countless patients across dozens of species. But like other human contributions, her innovations had seemed almost too simple to be revolutionary. Foster had focused on basic principles that other medical researchers considered beneath their notice. She studied nutrition, exercise, stress, management, and other fundamental aspects of health that more advanced civilizations had moved beyond in favor of technological solutions. Her treatments often involved changes in diet and lifestyle that seemed primitive compared to the sophisticated drugs and procedures that were standard practice. But now that she was gone, medical professionals were discovering that her simple methods had been preventing diseases and complications that their advanced treatments could not handle. Patients who had been stable under Foster's care were beginning to show symptoms that no one understood. Conditions that had been easily managed were becoming serious problems again. Dr. Velkoth, the chief medical officer at the Central Medical Complex, reviewed the latest patient reports with growing alarm. Recovery times were increasing across all treatment categories. Surgical complications that had become rare were happening more frequently. Even routine procedures were producing unexpected results. The most disturbing discovery was that Foster's treatments had not just been addressing immediate medical problems. She had been identifying and preventing long-term health issues that would not have become apparent for years or even decades. Without her guidance, many patients were facing serious complications that could have been avoided with the proper preventive care. As the months passed and the problems continued to multiply, a disturbing pattern was becoming clear to anyone who cared to look. The humans had not been the junior partners that everyone had assumed them to be. They had been quietly managing critical systems and processes throughout galactic civilization, handling the complex details that kept everything running smoothly, while more important beings focused on higher matters. Their departure was not just an inconvenience or a diplomatic incident. It was revealing fundamental weaknesses in the very structure of galactic society that no one had suspected existed. The Council was slowly beginning to realize that they might have seriously underestimated humanity's importance to their civilization. 1 year had passed since humanity vanished from galactic space, and the situation was becoming desperate. What had started as minor inconveniences had grown into major crises that threatened the stability of the entire galactic order. The problems were spreading faster than anyone could solve them, and new disasters seemed to emerge every day. The Krell Syndicate A collection of criminal organizations that had been kept in check for decades was now expanding boldly into territories that had once been safe and secure. Their fleets moved through space with confidence, attacking merchant vessels and raiding peaceful colonies without fear of serious retaliation. The Council's military forces, still struggling with their coordination problems, could barely respond to one crisis before three more appeared elsewhere. Captain Bobby Chen had been humanity's diplomatic troubleshooter in the Outer Rim territories. He was not an official ambassador or a high-ranking government representative. Instead, he was the kind of person that others called when situations were getting out of hand and needed someone with a calm head and creative thinking to prevent them from becoming worse. Chen had spent most of his time traveling between small colonies and trading posts, mediating disputes that were too minor for the Council's attention, but too serious for local authorities to handle alone. He talked to angry miners, frustrated merchants, worried colonists, and anyone else who had problems that needed solving. His methods were simple and direct. He listened to everyone involved, found common ground where others saw only conflict, and somehow convinced people to work together instead of fighting each other. The absence of Chen's steady influence was being felt across dozens of star systems. Old grievances that had been settled were flaring up again. Trade disputes that had been resolved were turning into armed conflicts. Colonial governments that had learned to cooperate were falling back into suspicious isolation. On the mining world of Kepler-7, two different species were fighting over water rights that had been peacefully shared for over 5 years. The Burr. Hegemony colonists claimed that the insectoid Krell were taking more than their fair allocation. The Krell insisted that the hegemony settlers were polluting the water sources and making them unsafe for Krell consumption. Governor Hextall tried to remember how Chen had handled this exact same dispute when it first arose. The human had spent 3 days talking to representatives from both groups, visiting the water extraction sites and studying the technical data about consumption and contamination. His final solution had seemed almost too simple to work, but it had kept the peace for years. Now the two groups were building defensive positions and making threats about protecting their vital resources. The colonial security forces were caught in the middle, unsure about how to prevent violence without taking sides. Similar conflicts were breaking out on dozens of other worlds where Chen had previously established delicate balances between competing interests. The Council's scientific progress had slowed to a crawl without human contributions. Dr. Steve Martinez had been working quietly in research facilities across the galaxy, solving theoretical problems that had puzzled alien scientists for centuries. His solutions always appeared just when they were needed most, allowing important projects to move forward and breakthrough discoveries to be made. Martinez had never claimed credit for his work or demanded recognition for his contributions. He preferred to work behind the scenes, offering suggestions and insights that helped other researchers overcome obstacles in their own studies. His approaches were often unconventional and sometimes seemed to violate established scientific principles, but they produced results that could not be argued with. The Nexus Collective's Advanced Physics Institute was struggling with a project that had been moving smoothly until Martinez disappeared. They were trying to develop a new type of faster-than-light communication system that would revolutionize interstellar coordination. The theoretical framework was solid, and the basic technology was available, but they could not solve a series of quantum mechanical problems that were preventing the system from working reliably. Dr. Quintel, the Institute's senior researcher, reviewed Martinez's old notes for the 100th time, searching for clues about how the human had approached similar problems in the past. The notes were frustratingly incomplete, containing only brief observations and seemingly random calculations that had somehow led to important breakthroughs. He must have been using some kind of intuitive process that we do not understand, Quintel explained to his research team, his crystalline structure flickering with frustrated energy patterns. His methods appear almost random, but they consistently produced correct results. Food production problems were spreading to more worlds as agricultural techniques developed by human farmers could not be replicated by other species. Maria Gonzalez had traveled throughout the galaxy, working with local farmers to improve crop yields and develop sustainable growing methods. Her techniques had seemed simple and old-fashioned compared to the high-technology approaches favored. by more advanced civilizations. Gonzalez had focused on soil health, crop rotation, natural pest control, and other basic farming principles that many species considered primitive. She worked with simple tools and relied on careful observation, rather than sophisticated equipment. Her methods required more labor and attention than automated systems, but they produced better results and were more reliable over the long term. The agricultural colony of New Harvest had been one of Gonzalez's greatest successes. When she first arrived, the colonists were struggling to grow enough food to support their population on the marginal soil of their new world. Previous attempts at farming had failed because the high-technology approaches that worked on other planets were not suitable for the unique conditions they faced. Gonzalez had spent 6 months studying the local environment, testing different approaches and working with colonial farmers to develop methods that were specifically adapted to their situation. The techniques she developed had increased food production by over 300% and made the colony self-sufficient for the first time. But now the crops were failing again. The soil that had been healthy and productive under Gonzalez's management was becoming depleted and contaminated. The natural pest control systems she had established were breaking down, allowing destructive insects to damage the plants. The colonists were facing the possibility of famine if they could not solve these problems quickly. Colonial Administrator Jexron stood in the middle of what had once been a thriving wheat field and tried to understand what had gone wrong. The plants were withering despite having adequate water and nutrients. The soil tests showed chemical imbalances that had not existed when Gonzalez was managing the operation. She made it look so easy, Jexron said to his agricultural advisor, a Vorthak expert who had been trying unsuccessfully to restore the failing farms. Everything she did seemed obvious and straightforward, but we cannot reproduce her results. The economic crisis was deepening as trade networks that had been established through human negotiation continued to collapse. These networks had been based on complex relationships and unwritten understandings that other species could not replicate or maintain. Without the human intermediaries who had built and maintained these relationships, trust was breaking down and commerce was contracting rapidly. The emergency council session was filled with tension and barely controlled panic. Representatives from dozens of species were reporting similar problems throughout their territories. Critical systems were failing, conflicts were escalating, and solutions that had worked for years were no longer effective. Representative Goldtune of the Spiral Confederation stood before the assembled delegates and delivered a report that many of them did not want to hear. His analysis of the crisis was thorough and methodical, but his conclusions were deeply disturbing. We have conducted extensive investigations into the human presence throughout our territories, Goldtune announced, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome truth. Our findings suggest that humanity's role in galactic civilization was far more significant than we previously understood. The chamber fell silent as delegates waited for details they suspected would be uncomfortable to hear. In every sector, where humans were present, they were not simply following orders or performing assigned tasks. They were identifying problems, developing solutions, and implementing improvements that we did not recognize as such. They were, in effect, quietly managing critical aspects of our civilization while we focused on other matters. The implications of this assessment were staggering. If humans had been managing essential systems throughout galactic space, their sudden departure represented a catastrophic loss of institutional knowledge and practical expertise that could not be easily replaced. Military strategist Nexcol delivered an even more troubling analysis of the security situation. His assessment of human military contributions revealed that they had been identifying and quietly addressing vulnerabilities in the Council's defense systems that no one else had noticed. Every human military advisor appears to have been conducting comprehensive security evaluations while performing their regular duties, Nexcol reported. They identified weak points in our defenses, developed countermeasures for 2 years had passed since humanity vanished from galactic space, and the Galactic Council was facing the greatest crisis in its 1,000-year history. The warning signals had been flashing red for months, but no one had wanted to believe what the deep space monitoring stations were reporting. Now there was no denying the terrible truth that was approaching from the edge of the galaxy. The Void Reapers had returned. The ancient enemy that had terrorized galactic civilization in the distant past was moving through space again, leaving nothing but empty darkness behind them. An entire star system in the outer reaches had been completely obliterated, its planets reduced to cosmic dust and its star extinguished like a candle flame. The few automated probes that had witnessed the destruction transmitted horrifying images before they too were consumed by the advancing darkness. Council Chairman Veltar stood before the emergency assembly and delivered the news that every delegate had hoped they would never hear. His crystalline form seemed dimmer than usual, as if the weight of impending catastrophe was affecting even his basic physical structure. The Centauri system no longer exists, Veltar announced to the stunned gathering. All 7 planets, 3 space stations, and approximately 40 million inhabitants have been eliminated. Our long-range sensors detect no remaining trace of the system, except for residual radiation patterns consistent with total molecular dissolution. The chamber erupted in frightened exclamations and panicked discussions as representatives from dozens of species tried to process the implications of what they had just heard. The Void Reapers were not just raiders or conquerors who could be negotiated with or bought off. They were something far worse, an enemy that seemed to exist only to destroy everything they encountered. Admiral Colthex, the Council's supreme military commander, tried to maintain some semblance of order as he addressed the terrified assembly. His forearms gestured in complex patterns that betrayed his own deep anxiety, despite his attempts to project confidence and control. Our defense forces are being mobilized to establish a protective perimeter around core systems, Colthex announced, but his voice lacked the certainty that such a statement required. We are implementing all available countermeasures based on historical records from previous Void Reaper encounters. But everyone in the chamber knew that the historical records were incomplete and largely useless. The Void Reapers had been defeated in ancient times through methods that were no longer understood by any living species. The old strategies and technologies had been lost to time, leaving the current generation to face an enemy they were completely unprepared to fight. The situation became even more desperate when intelligence reports revealed the true scope of the infrastructure failures that humanity's departure had caused. Former Admiral Linda Davis had spent her final years with the Council quietly updating defense protocols and strengthening security systems throughout galactic space. Her work had seemed routine and unremarkable at the time, just another human, completing assigned tasks with their typical attention to detail. But now that the Void Reapers were advancing, military analysts were discovering that Davis had been preparing for exactly this kind of threat. Her modifications to defense networks, her upgrades to early warning systems, and her changes to military communication protocols had all been designed to counter an enemy that used the same tactics and technologies as the approaching Void Reapers. The problem was that all of Davis's work was protected by encryption systems that no one could break. Her files were locked behind security protocols that seemed simple on the surface but proved impossible to bypass. Every attempt to access her strategic plans and defensive preparations resulted in complete data destruction, as if she had anticipated that someone might try to use her work without proper authorization. Military engineer Dexval had been leading a team of the galaxy's best code breakers and computer specialists in a desperate attempt to unlock Davis's encrypted files. They had been working around the clock for weeks using every technique and technology available to the Council, but they had made no progress whatsoever. The encryption appears to be based on human psychological patterns rather than mathematical algorithms, Dexval reported to the Emergency Military Council. Each layer of security requires knowledge of human cultural references, historical events, and thought processes that we simply do not possess. Even worse, the physical infrastructure that Davis had modified throughout the galaxy was beginning to fail according to a precise schedule that suggested deliberate planning. The enhanced communication arrays that had improved military coordination were shutting down one by one. The upgraded sensor networks that had provided early warning of potential threats were going offline without explanation. The reinforced defense platforms that had protected key systems were experiencing cascading failures that rendered them useless. Chief Engineer Ron Parker had been responsible for infrastructure projects across dozens of worlds, and his work was failing with the same methodical precision that characterized all human preparations for departure. Bridges that had stood for years were collapsing simultaneously. Power grids that had been upgraded and improved were experiencing systematic failures that left entire planets in darkness. Life support systems that had been enhanced to provide better reliability were requiring constant manual overrides to prevent complete shutdown. The failures were not random accidents or the result of poor maintenance. They followed a careful timeline that suggested Parker had built controlled obsolescence into every project he had touched. Everything he had created was designed to work perfectly for exactly the amount of time that humanity remained in galactic space, and then to stop functioning when they were no longer available to provide ongoing support. Governor Talrek stood in the emergency command center of the industrial world of Kepler Prime and watched helplessly as critical systems failed around him. The planet's manufacturing facilities, which produced essential supplies for the entire sector, were shutting down as their power systems experienced cascading failures. The transportation networks that moved goods and people across the planet were grinding to a halt as bridges and tunnels became unusable. How did he know exactly when everything would break down? Talrex asked his engineering staff, but no one had an answer. Parker's maintenance schedules and replacement timelines had seemed conservative and overly cautious when he created them. Now it was clear that he had been planning for humanity's departure years in advance. The economic impact of these infrastructure failures was devastating at the worst possible time. With the Void Reapers approaching, the Council needed to mobilize every available resource for defense and evacuation efforts. Instead, they were struggling to maintain basic services and prevent complete societal collapse on dozens of worlds. Trade networks that had been carefully constructed through human negotiation were completely broken. The complex web of relationships and agreements that had kept goods and services flowing throughout galactic space had collapsed without the human intermediaries who had built and maintained them. Trust between different species was breaking down as economic hardship led to accusations and conflicts. Helen Morrison had been humanity's chief trade negotiator, responsible for establishing the commercial relationships that had created the most prosperous era in galactic history. Her work had seemed straightforward enough, just another example of humans handling the detailed negotiations that other species found tedious or beneath their dignity. But Morrison's negotiations had been based on deep understanding of each species' psychology, culture, and long-term interests. She had created agreements that satisfied everyone involved by finding creative solutions to problems that seemed impossible to resolve. Her trade networks had been stable because they were built on genuine mutual benefit rather than simple profit maximization. Without Morrison's careful balancing of competing interests, the trade relationships she had established were falling apart. Species that had been partners for years were becoming suspicious of each other's motives. Commercial disputes that had been prevented through careful contract language were escalating into serious conflicts. The economic cooperation that had funded galactic defense efforts was disappearing just when it was needed most. The emergency council session was dominated by reports of failure and crisis from every sector of galactic civilization. Military readiness was declining as equipment failures and coordination problems prevented effective response to the Void Reaper threat. Economic collapse was spreading as trade networks and infrastructure systems continued to fail. Social order was breaking down as different species blamed each other for the mounting problems. Military strategist Nexcole delivered the assessment that everyone had been dreading. His analysis of the Council's defensive capabilities against the Void Reaper threat was thorough, methodical, and utterly hopeless. Based on our current military strength and the rate of infrastructure degradation, we estimate that organized resistance will be possible for no more than 6 months after the Void Reapers reach the core systems, Nexcole announced to the silent assembly. Without access to the defensive preparations that appear to have been made by former Admiral Davis, our prospects for survival are. The transmission arrived without warning on the 3rd anniversary of humanity's departure from galactic civilization. Every communication device in Council space received the signal simultaneously, from the smallest personal communicators to the massive broadcast arrays that served entire star systems. The message bypassed all security protocols and encryption systems as if they did not exist. appearing on screens across the galaxy with the clarity and authority of absolute technological superiority. Admiral Paul Harrison's weathered face filled the displays, his expression carrying the weight of final judgment. Behind him stood other humans in military uniforms that bore no resemblance to the simple work clothes that council members remembered. These were clearly the leaders of a sophisticated military organization, their bearing and equipment suggesting technological capabilities far beyond anything the Council had imagined possible. The great assembly hall of the Galactic Council fell, silent as delegates stared at the transmission in shock and growing fear. Chairman Veltar's crystalline form flickered with confused energy patterns as he tried to process what he was seeing. The humans who had departed so quietly 3 years ago had clearly been far more than the humble technicians and advisors that everyone had assumed them to be. To the Galactic Council, Harrison began, his voice carrying easily across space to reach every inhabited world and starship in the galaxy. You have been weighed, measured, and found wanting. The simple declaration sent ripples of fear through the assembled delegates. This was not the tone of a junior species seeking favor or attempting to negotiate their return to galactic society. This was the voice of absolute authority, delivering a verdict that had already been decided. Harrison continued his statement with calm precision, each word chosen to deliver maximum impact. For the past 50 years, humanity has conducted the greatest anthropological study in galactic history. Every human who served in your council, worked in your facilities, or lived among your people was a volunteer in an experiment designed to answer a single question. Can a collection of advanced species learn to govern themselves wisely, or are they doomed to repeat the cycles of dominance and collapse that we observed in our own history? The implications of this revelation were staggering. Every interaction between humans and other species had been part of a carefully designed research project. The humans had not been learning from galactic civilization. They had been studying it with the detached objectivity of scientists observing laboratory subjects. Colonel Nancy Wright stepped forward to display tactical projections that covered the wall behind the human delegation. The holographic images showed detailed analyses of every major conflict, crisis, and decision that had occurred during humanity's presence in galactic space. Each event was broken down into causes, effects, and potential alternatives that had been available but not chosen. During our time among you, human advisors prevented 17 major wars, stopped 6 attempted genocides, and maintained the stability that allowed your golden age of prosperity and peace, Wright announced. We did this not out of loyalty to your council, but as part of our research into whether your species could learn to handle these challenges independently. The projection changed to show specific examples of human intervention in galactic affairs. Captain Jake Morrison had not simply been performing routine diplomatic duties during his years with the Council. He had been carefully managing tensions between hostile species, diffusing conflicts before they could escalate, and creating the conditions necessary for peaceful cooperation. His quiet competence had been masking sophisticated political manipulation, designed to maintain stability for research purposes. Dr. Lisa Campbell had not been conducting basic scientific research during her time with the Council. She had been leading advanced studies into the fundamental nature of reality itself, making breakthrough discoveries that she had carefully hidden behind the appearance of routine experimentation. Her real work had been developing technologies that were centuries ahead of anything the Council possessed. The scientific revelations were followed by even more disturbing military intelligence. The projection displayed comprehensive tactical assessments of every species in the Council, detailing their strengths, weaknesses, military capabilities, and potential for growth or decline. The analysis was thorough, objective, and clearly the product of decades of careful observation and study. Every human military advisor was simultaneously conducting detailed security evaluations while performing their assigned duties, Wright continued. We identified vulnerabilities in your defense networks, developed countermeasures for potential threats, and established contingency plans for scenarios that your own strategists had failed to consider. The most shocking revelation came when, Dr. Kevin Lee stepped forward to present the anthropological findings that had been the true purpose of humanity's presence in galactic space. His analysis was detailed, methodical, and devastating in its conclusions about the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. "You believed us primitive because we worked with our hands," Dr. Lee announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute scientific certainty. "You assigned us menial tasks because you could not comprehend that we chose to serve in those capacities while we studied your social structures, decision-making processes, and capacity for growth." The projection displayed comparative analyses of human and alien approaches to governance, problem-solving, and social organization. The data showed that while other species had achieved impressive technological advancement, they had failed to develop the social and political wisdom necessary to use their capabilities responsibly. "Your species achieved faster-than-light travel, energy manipulation, and advanced computing," Lee continued. "But you never learned to cooperate effectively, think beyond immediate self-interest, or make decisions based on long-term consequences rather than short-term advantage." Director Beth Taylor, who was clearly humanity's actual scientific leader rather than the junior researcher the Council had believed her to be, presented the final analysis that would determine humanity's future relationship with galactic civilization. "The experiment is complete," Taylor announced with the finality of absolute judgment. "Over the course of 50 years, we provided you with subtle guidance, prevented your worst mistakes, and created conditions that should have allowed your species to develop the wisdom necessary for responsible self-governance. Instead, you became dependent on our management while believing yourselves to be our superiors." The transmission moved to its final phase as Ambassador Carl Williams, humanity's true diplomatic leader, delivered the verdict that would determine the fate of galactic civilization. His analysis was comprehensive, covering every aspect of the Council's performance during the years of human observation. "You had every advantage," Williams stated with calm precision. "Advanced technology, abundant resources, peaceful conditions, and subtle guidance from a species with thousands of years of experience in avoiding the pitfalls of interstellar governance. Yet you learned nothing from the opportunities we provided. The way projection displayed the ultimate test that humanity had prepared for the galactic species. The Void Reapers approaching from the edge of space were not an unexpected catastrophe. They were an ancient enemy that humanity had fought and defeated multiple times throughout their history. The Council's inability to recognize the threat or prepare adequate defenses was the final proof of their fundamental inadequacy. The Void Reapers you now face represent a test that every sufficiently advanced civilization must eventually confront," Harrison concluded, his image dominating screens across the galaxy. "We have defeated them 3 times in our own history, through courage, wisdom, and the ability to unite in the face of existential threat. We will not do so a 4th time on your behalf." The transmission ended with a statement that left no room for negotiation or appeal. "You must learn to stand together and fight for your survival, or fall separately as you have chosen to live. The choice is yours, but humanity will no longer intervene to save you from the consequences of your own failures." As the screens went dark, the Galactic Council sat in stunned silence. The comfortable illusion of their own superiority had been completely shattered. They had never been the advanced civilization they believed themselves to be. They had been children playing at governance while humanity quietly managed the adult responsibilities of maintaining peace, stability, and progress. The approaching Void Reapers represented not just a military threat, but the ultimate test of whether the galactic species could finally learn to work together without human guidance. In the distance, the ancient enemy continued their advance toward the heart of galactic civilization, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the Council would have to face a crisis entirely on their own. The judgment had been delivered, and now the galaxy would discover whether they were capable of earning the survival that humanity would no longer provide for them.